focus on the software process models as well as Agile. Agile is relatively a hot topic, so I'm just going to quickly tell you a little bit about that. Okay, so software processes or the software methodology is basically a set of related activities that you would follow when you are busy developing software. They can be used when you are creating something from scratch or actually modifying an existing system. So an example of that is some companies have a main piece of software that they developed, and then they sell you access to that platform. However, when you purchase this access, they also include things such as the customization. So, for example, adding your own data, adding your own branding, maybe adding some specific features for your use case. So all this is included also in the software process. Okay, so there's four main types of activities. So you'll see some of these are very similar to what we've already spoken about. So we have the software requirements engineering. This is what we'll talk about next week, as mentioned. We have the software design and implementation, the verification and validation. So checking that we actually did everything that the client wants. And lastly, the evolution or maintenance. So what happens after we deliver the final product? Do we maintain it? Do they want us to keep adding different functionalities every couple of months, etc.? What happens then? Then, similar to all the other life cycles, these four main points are just the main framework. There's a bunch of other smaller activities in between that is maybe not featured now, but it is quite important to also go through these processes. So that's change management, quality assurance, user experience testing, etc. Okay. Then we're going to talk about four different process models. All these are basically just an abstract guide. When you decide on a specific process to follow, these they can be adapted and or extended for your specific needs. In some cases, there's also hybrids. It very much depends on what you and your team would need to actually use these models. Okay, so the first one we're talking about is the waterfall model. This is a very this is the basically the grandfather of all the process models. So it is a sequential approach, which is very linear. So in this case, there's a lot of planning that needs to happen upfront. Before you can actually start with the development, you need to be sure what you're actually developing. Also, there's not really room for a lot of changes. So what I mean with this, if we look at this, is we define the requirements, we do the system design, we do the implementation and testing, the integration and testing, and the operation. Although there is options to go backwards, there's not really a very clear iterative approach here. So in principle, you need to have everything done before you start the next phase. There's not really supposed to be any overlap, but in practice, this does not happen. There is clear overlap. There is some iterative processes happening. It's not so simple as it looks. Okay, when should you use this? Basically, when you know your requirements, when they are very well understood, as well as not likely to change. So this is definitely not for a system where we are trying things to see what would work and what would not. This is a very clearly defined problem, which has a very clearly defined solution. Then you would use the waterfall model. So the next one is prototyping. So I personally like this approach quite a bit. So this is something that can also be used within other models. So prototyping, there's a bunch of text there, you can go through it. But basically when your client has a problem and the solution is not that clear, you want to create a prototype to show them what would be possible. Then they can look through it, and actually that can be part of the requirement elicitation process. So while you engage with the prototype, yourself and the client, that you can actually figure out what they want, what they don't want, to get a better idea of what should the final product look like. The prototype is not at all something that can actually be used. It's just a way of showcasing what is possible to your client. In this case, the client is also very much involved in the process, not just in the start and the end, but throughout the process. Okay. So prototyping, there's two ways for requirement engineering, as I talked about, where we help to see what is the requirements. We allow the users to experiment and refine the requirements. We see if there's any errors in the requirements and things like that, see what is possible. Or as part of the system design part, where we use a prototype to check the feasibility. So is it actually feasible to create this within the specific time frame and budget constraints? Okay, so here we can see a bit of a illustration of what this looks like. So we have establishing the prototype objectives. So what is this prototype actually going to do? What is the scope of this? Then we define the functionality. What is included, what is not, what functionality will we test, what not. We develop the prototype and then we evaluate the prototype. And along this, there's four documents that is basically the output. The next one is incremental development. So this is based on the idea of developing an initial implementation, getting feedback, then repeating the process. So you do small increments. So is that whole thing about how do you eat an elephant piece by piece? You create a solution for a piece of the problem, show it to the client, get feedback, add something to it, get feedback, add something to it, get feedback. So it's a very iterative process. The client looks at your implementation at the early stage, and that helps to create a more suitable or exact application that your client is actually looking for. Okay, so here you can see a bit of an outline. So these are concurrent events. You have the specification, the development, the validation. With an initial, there's a bunch of intermediate versions which the client gives feedback on, as well as the final version that is then created. Okay, the spiral model. This is a risk-driven approach where we try to create our process in such a way to minimize the amount of risk involved. Each loop in the spiral represents a specific phase. So you can see here, for example, the first one is the system feasibility, the next one is the requirements definition, the next is design, etc., etc. Okay, so here you can see we basically start there with the review, the risk analysis, the prototype, conceptual operation, requirement, then we do another risk analysis, another prototype, etc. And you can see that you go through the same phases over and over and over again. So with the risk analysis every time happening. Okay, spiral model. There's four main sectors. The objective setting. So what is the objectives? What is the risk for each of these phases? The risk assessment and reduction. So looking at what is the risks and how can we reduce these. Development and validation. So looking at what has been done, what needs to be done, what the risk is involved there. So if the risk is expected in the user interface, we must prototype the user interface before we actually start implementing the user interface. And then lastly, the planning. So here we make decisions on how to move forward. Okay, the last one is the iterative development. So this aims to develop a system through small portions of features across all components. So you can see this is very similar to the incremental approach, except for you don't focus on one component, you focus on many components. All phases are done at once, while the construction will be incrementally visited in each of the iterations. So here you can see this is so every time you go through the inception, the elaboration, the construction, and the transition. So you review your requirements every single iteration. You do some designing, you do some implementation, you do some testing every single time. Okay. There's ever a wide range of other options. These are just some of the main ones on which others are built. Next is, what is Agile? So Agile is an approach that allows us to create and respond to change. So in an environment where there's a lot of change, a very dynamic environment, Agile is a solution to this. So it's not something that is just extreme Scrum or extreme programming or feature-driven development. It doesn't only include practices such as pair programming, test development, stand-up, etc. It's much more of a philosophical approach. Okay, so Agile is a way of working based on iterative development and incremental delivery with an ongoing assessment of the product. So what I mean with this is, you can see here, you do planning, you do analysis, design, coding, and testing in one iteration. Then there's always repeated again in your second iteration and third iteration. So you can see this aligns very much with the iterative approach we just spoke about. But these iterations are all limited between 2 weeks and 2 months. So we decide on a time period, we implement something, and then we actually review, reflect on what we did, and we move on to the next sprint. In this case, it's called. Okay, so this is basically what a sprint looks like. So that's one of these circles. So we have the backlog. So we look at what can we do, what is next. We start prioritizing all these to see what should we focus on in this specific sprint. Then while we are doing the sprint, the development, we do daily stand-ups. During these, every team member gets up. This is just a 10-minute thing. Every team member just quickly say what they've done, what problems they have, and what is the work that they will focus on next. So the sprint process lasts 2 weeks to 2 months, as I said. So when we get to the end, we do the review and the retrospective, where we see what went well, what didn't go well, what we actually implemented, to see, okay, what will we do in the next sprint. So here is just a little bit of illustration of the waterfall process compared to the agile process. So you can see here is a sprint that has a release, and this repeats again. With the risk, there's a slight bit of risk when we release a new version, but then because the user can then actually interact with it, the risk is then reduced again. Where with the waterfall model, we don't release until the actual end, so our risk is much higher. Okay, that's a very brief overview of Agile and all the different software engineering processes. Hope that gives you an idea of what is actually happening there.